Descartes and Locke gave us a picture of experience as something taking place within us that was distinct from anything physiological.
Descartes has been, for the thinkers that I've spent my life studying, Descartes has been a terrible distraction and dead-end road, but people are still proceeding down it.
Descartes was a philosopher and mathematician. He was born in Le Hay, France, and lived during the time of the Wars of Religion. During the Wars of Religion, there was a great deal of fighting and suffering and death over ideas about God and religion. And Descartes wanted to find certainty in matters of belief, and he found this certainty in this idea: I think, therefore I am. His reasoning was that I could be deceived about anything, but not about my own existence, at least not while I'm being deceived. And so on this idea, he proposed to build a firm foundation for all possible future knowledge. And this move toward the subjective or the internal as a foundation of knowing is known as Cartesianism.
By Cartesianism, I mean an orientation which affirms the primacy of the I or the self in isolation from others. So the starting point is the isolated individual, the individual who in his or her isolation feels a desperate need to connect with others. So by Cartesianism, I mean the primacy of subjectivity or selfhood, and it's basically the spectator, the I as spectator, the I as originally solitary, and only eventually, and in some respects, incidentally, social.
One thing I tend to see in philosophers, this is certainly not always the case, but it's sometimes the case, is that there's a kind of distance from their own life and experience that, or detachment, that is a little bit disturbing, or a little bit, feels to me sometimes a little bit inhuman. I've had a sensation sometimes that the philosopher is looking at me kind of like I'm a bug or something like that, you know what I'm saying? Like that things and people become mere phenomena, or merely to feed the intellectual machine, or merely examples of general concepts and so on. If that happens in a thorough enough way, philosophy just becomes a disease, sort of. You know, it's a way of deferring, avoiding experience. Cartesian dualism or something like that is perfectly conditioned, perfectly suited to, it's a mere statement of that detachment.
If you say certain things such as the self is primary, the self is originally solitary, that commits you substantively to a recognizable philosophical position, namely Cartesianism.
Yeah, this is key. And the fact that in the philosophers that I and others would call analytic, we get various residua of Cartesianism, I think. Say in Jerry Fodor, we get a kind of highly sophisticated Cartesian dualism in which he can't begin to explain where concepts come from. We just have them, and he would eschew the notion of two substances. But nevertheless, it's a version of Cartesianism, which I think is utterly alienating. It disengages us from our actual engagement, or I would rather say engulfment, in the world around us.
I think the Cartesian project is animated by the endeavor to equip oneself to be an epistemically omnicompetent. So one can have all the powers one needs unto oneself, within oneself, to know the real. And then by extension, this can be pushed to political omnicompetence or moral omnicompetence. So the all-competent knower, the all-competent citizen, the all-competent agent. Part of the drive for this is radical insecurity, and so the quest for certainty is in some sense just the other side of this gnawing of insecurity and uncertainty. There's a sense in which Cartesianism is a quest for self-sufficiency, where the self in that expression is the solitary self. And what's crucial here is to reframe most or all of this in terms of the social self. And what pragmatism does, and it did it earlier than most other movements, it seems to me, is to recognize the irreducible character of the social self, that we are social beings.
Avoiding Descartes' subjectivism and his mind-body dualism requires a phenomenology, a description of how the world actually grabs us hot off the griddle of the world, as William James put it. It requires a phenomenology. So the evasion of Cartesian subjectivism requires an analysis of, you might say, our subjectivity in our being gripped by the world in which we are involved necessarily and engaged.